Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hearts of Iron 4. Today I'll be talking about resistance and garrisons. This is on By Blood alone, and that means obviously I have the La Résistance DLC installed, which is kind of necessary for all of this to happen. So if you do have, let's go and get stuck into what garrisoning is. Well, if you are occupying territory that isn't your core state, so for example this is my core state. That up here is not. that's a Soviet core state. So if I am occupying territory, generally people tend to be rather unhappy about it. And people tend to fight back. Think about, German occupation of France and the Low Countries, stuff like that. So how do we see what's going on and what are the effects of all of this? Well, let's begin by just observing where we're currently at. We've got two map modes that are relevant for this. We've got the resistance map mode, which shows us how many, a couple of things. It shows us how high the level of resistance is, and it shows us a trend. So right now here we have a resistance of 31%, but we have a resistance target of 34%, and there's a little red upwards facing triangle next to it, which tells us that the resistance is actually growing. So generally we can see that the resistance in most of the places that we're occupying is high and growing. We also have actual effects after certain levels. These people are starting to organize, so they're talking to each other, they're coordinating their attacks on us, and that means they get an increased chance to do bad things and to damage our garrisons. Where do we see? Well, we also have this little warning up here, tells us there is a resistance in your occupied territories. So where do we see our garrisons? Because we don't have any troops that we're actively managing that are garrisoning things. You can see this in the Occupied Territories tab, and this gives you an overview of the territory that we're occupying that isn't ours, and their respective resistance levels. So we are occupying parts of the Polish Republic, and we're occupying parts of the Soviet Union. In general, the average resistance in that territory is about this much, and the average compliance, which is the other side, is that much. So think about resistance and compliance as so two sides of the same coin, right? Again, if you're thinking of German occupied territory in World War II, you would have collaborators who would happily join the occupiers, who would do things like guard duty, who would betray their compatriots, and more nefarious things. And you would have people who are running resistance, who would smuggle weapons, who would do sabotage acts, who would smuggle information to the opposing side, things like that. So one of them is resistance, the other one is compliance. And you generally want the compliance to grow and the resistance to lower, because this has bad and good effects, respectively. The higher the resistance, the more damage it does to your garrisons. So where are my garrisons, actually? Well, garrisons are managed off-map, which means that you don't actually deploy divisions actively to garrison your territory. It's done off-map, but you can select which kind of division you want to have. Yeah, and that is then the division that gets applied. So in this case, we have a cavalry division here that is used, and you can select that per country that you're occupying, which one it is. And there's a factor next to it as to how many of these divisions are deployed. We'll get into the exact division layout for that in a little bit later. But there's a couple more pieces of information here. So it tells me that we've got 2 divisions deployed of this template, and this is handled automatically. You don't have to train them, you don't have to deploy them, it just happens by itself. It is currently at 84% garrison efficiency, which means which results from the fact that while it has 100% of the manpower required, and that's 8,000 troops of my own manpower, it only has an equipment ratio of 45%. So half of the occupying troops are riding around on horses, but they're armed only with sticks, which makes them a lot less effective against rebellious elements than if they had actual firearms. The resistance, if it grows too much, will lead to increased casualties, both in terms of manpower and in terms of equipment, and will eventually lead to rebellion once it reaches 90%. That's 90% average resistance across the territory, at which point effectively you lose control and you have to recapture the territory. Usually it won't get that far because you'll be running out of other things before that happens. On the flip side, the compliance has positive effects. So you see how much manpower you're able to recruit, and how many factories and how many resources you're getting. In part, this depends also on the compliance. So let's have a quick look what happens when you have good compliance. So at 13%, we get informants, which just increases the amount of chance to detect enemy operatives. So if there's a British spy operating in this area, we have an increased chance that one of our compliant collaborators on the ground is going to tell the occupying forces about it and have the garrison arrest them, which is a good thing. At 25%, we get local police force. So the locals are increasingly convinced that you are actually a liberator and not an occupying force, and agree to, police themselves, which generally has the positive effect that well, you don't need that many garrisons, because if people start policing themselves, we don't need to have any of our soldiers doing it. So this reduces the required garrisons. At 40%, we are starting to get more resources and more of the factories from the occupied territory. So more of the extracted minerals and more of the factories that are there will then become available to us. At 60%, we get an additional recruitable population bonus of 20%. And at 80%, you get the option to release the country into a subservient client state where the government is effectively deferring to you. And you control more or less what they're doing, but you can release them and you do not need to garrison them at all anymore. This is optional, you don't have to do this, but you get the event pop-up to happen. So let's take a closer look at where these resistance targets are coming from. Well, we've already seen that our Garrison Division isn't fully equipped. We don't have enough material. We don't have enough rifles to give to our cavalrymen to actually, be an effective garrison by threatening people at gunpoint to stop complaining and to stop sabotaging things. That is having an impact. So right now we've got a resistance target of 34%. We have a base value of 35. That is exacerbated by the fact that we have low stability, and it is slightly reduced by our current garrison law, which then it's scaled down due to the fact that we don't actually have enough guns to make this happen. Then we have resistance spread. And this is where the organization of these people comes in, because if one region starts resisting, like this one up here, then from there, news are spreading that the locals are standing up against the occupiers, and that actually increases the resistance in other territories. So you see how that sort of snowball effect is happening, right? It's snowballing down here, and it's subsequently increasing the resistance target in the areas. That doesn't mean the resistance is going to jump that high, but it's gradually increasing. And then we have compliance, which is actually countering the effects of the resistance, and that's kind of how these things balance each other out. So how do we get the division, and what is that division? So let's take a quick look. That is my cavalry division here. Let's see how it is designed. Now, right now, this is a forward cavalry division. The size of the division doesn't actually make an awful lot of difference, because as you can see over here, we have 20.61 divisions deployed. So the game that automatically deploys fractions of divisions as necessary. So you could make that a single battalion division, or you could make that a 50 battalion division. It doesn't make any difference here. The one point where this doesn't make a difference is the suppression factor. So that factor over here, this is the amount of, fear they can put in the hearts of their enemies when driving through the streets. And different battalions are better or worse at this. So, for example, if we look at cavalry, it has a suppression factor of 2. If we were to look at, say, an infantry division, it has a suppression factor of 1.5. If we are looking at an artillery, I don't think it has any suppression factor by itself. So what you want is manpower. What you want is people on the ground, and the cheap option is the cavalry. The more expensive but also more effective option is armored cars. So armored cars have a suppression factor of 2.5 compared to the suppression factor of 2 from the cavalry. And that's an option that you can use to, that would be one possible option to put in. Also, armored cars are adding hardness, which is slightly making, which is helping with taking less damage from the resistance, because the rebels don't have heavy arms, so they can't easily deal with armored or even slightly armored target. Anything that's impervious to small arms takes reduced damage from the rebels. And as such, anything that's armored, even like an armored car, would be a possibility. So we could even use medium tanks, which have the same suppression as armored cars, but are obviously considerably more expensive. So we don't want to do that. Cavalry is a good middle ground because it only requires infantry equipment. Now, like I said, you can make this a 1 battalion, or you can make this a significantly larger division. Why would you want to make this a larger division? Well, there is a support company that is that I don't think I actually have researched here, so I'm going to have to look that up in the tech tree. That there is a support company, and that is the military police. And the military police gives you a 20% suppression bonus, which means that because companies scale with the size of the division. The higher, the larger the division, the more of a bonus it gets, and the more effective it becomes, rather than having to deploy small divisions, which means you have to deploy more military police companies for the same effect, which because these guys are costing support equipment, means you have to pay more support equipment in order to make that happen. So if you want to use military police and you don't have to, then it makes sense to make your division bigger. Other than that, there's absolutely no reason to do this. So you don't have to make your division larger. You can leave it at as is. The only thing I would suggest is that you strip everything else out, like recon or engineers or artillery or anything, because it doesn't help you at all. It just means lost equipment, because these divisions are provided off map from your stockpile of equipment, which you can see over here. Right here, you can see that I am actually not having enough infantry equipment, and this is part of the problem with resistance, because if you're not able to supply your garrison troops, either because you don't have the manpower or because you don't have the equipment, then your garrisons becomes more ineffective. More ineffective garrisons mean a higher resistance target. A higher resistance target means a spread of resistance, and it means more losses to garrisons. And this can spiral out of control to the point that if you're occupying territory, your main army can become deprived of equipment. So we're looking over at the production tab. We're producing infantry equipment currently, but in the recruitment tab, we have control over where this equipment goes. So here is your garrison equipment. These are this controls the priority with which your off-map garrison divisions are getting equipment. So if you don't want them to get the equipment, you can lower the priority and everything else gets the equipment first. But generally, you want to make sure that your garrisons are equipped, if at all possible, because of the snowball effect, because the resistance will spiral out of control, which means that all your equipment goes into garrison, your manpower gets drained, and you can see it up in your manpower tab. Right now, we have 90,000 men just controlling the territory, which is bad, because we can't use these to train or replace losses in frontline divisions. So the only thing that they're really good for is trying to keep this under control, And if we can't keep it under control, then this is going to snowball and cause us more and more problems. You can see it here in the Occupied Territories tab. There is actually a garrison log and an equipment details log. So here you see we have 90,000 men deployed, but they only have a 55% fulfillment rate, so they are short about 4,000 pieces of rifles, which reduces their effectiveness because they have to beat people into submission with sticks, which isn't as effective as shooting them or threatening to shoot them. We also have the garrison log, which tells us that over the last 12 months, we've lost 6,000 men. So these are off-map non-combat or combat casualties, but not in direct combat, but they have been killed by rebels or in confrontation with the locals. And we've lost almost 500 rifles. And this will increase because every time the resistance is doing something, the garrison has to stop them, which then leads to losses both in equipment and manpower. And the more emboldened the resistance get, the higher the losses get, the less equipment you have, and the more men you need to actually suppress this, which then results in higher losses and so forth. So this whole thing can very, very quickly snowball and cost you and effectively paralyze you or even deplete your manpower on the front lines. I have lost games to resistance simply because I didn't pay enough attention to it, and I haven't gotten it under control quickly enough that it has spiraled out of control and cost me too much equipment that I could no longer supply my frontline divisions. Talking about equipment, so you've seen that cavalry division, and that obviously needs infantry equipment, but it doesn't make we're producing relatively advanced infantry equipment. It doesn't make a difference what infantry equipment you have, because you're threatening. You're threatening civilians. It doesn't matter if you threaten them with an assault rifle or with the 19th century carbine. So when you're looking at the equipment tab, what you want to do is effectively exclude the new equipment, if possible. So as long as you have the stockpiles of old equipment, and especially if you're conquering territory, you end up having a lot of old rifles. Basic infantry equipment is completely enough to get the suppression value. You don't need the newer equipment because the equipment only improves your combat stats. But against civilians, it doesn't matter if you shoot them with what you shoot them with. So as long as you have enough of the basic infantry equipment, that is sufficient. And since that stuff is cheaper to produce, you can even do things like add a. If we're showing the outdated equipment, you could just add a production line and just put a couple of factories into basic equipment and just produce heaps of that stuff to fulfill your garrison duties and leave the more modern equipment to the army, so that the regular army. So that combination, together with the division design, where you'd say you'd tell your division to use the old equipment, and together with your deployment priorities of saying, actually my garrisons need equipment, but because they can't get the new equipment, they will only get the old equipment. So you can leave that on high priority, and that doesn't deplete your frontline troops of the newer equipment. So there are quite a few ways how you can fine-tune the whole thing. Let's quickly talk about the laws that you're running in your occupied territories, because these have an effect on resistance targets and the growth of compliance and what you get out of the territories. So right now my default, which is what you set up here, is civilian oversight. Civilian oversight effectively means you don't have people in uniform roaming the streets and putting the fear into anybody, and you just have your garrisons pretty much staying in their barracks and just reacting if somebody acts up. This reduces the damage to the garrisons, obviously, and it also reduces the amount of garrisons that you require. But it does not reduce your resistance target at all, and it doesn't do anything to your compliance growth. So with this, you get the maximum compliance growth. You also have the option of actually not garrisoning at all, but you're not getting any compliance gain. So I don't think this is ever an option that's particularly useful for anything. Civilian oversight is sort of a good default if you want to maximize your compliance gain. But what if this is getting out of control? As you can see, we've got resistance spilling over from the organization, and we are very short on material, and that's a problem. So there are a couple of options. You can start effectively sacrificing some compliance growth for putting down the problematic areas a little bit. So for example, if we were to use local police force, then we would get our resistance target down by 15%, and we would significantly reduce the amount of required garrisons and the amount of damage done to the garrisons. If the further down you go, the harsher effectively you're going, up to the point of brutal oppression, where you have curfews, after which anybody out in the streets just gets summarily executed. The law of the stronger, people getting shot, and this significantly reduces, unsurprisingly, the amount of compliance that you get out of things. And it also, at this point, then requires actually more garrisons. These harsher ones allow you to extract the maximum amount of things, as in factories and resources, without necessarily having to wait for compliance to go up. So if you're in a rush and you need stuff, these are options, but just be aware that they are costly options. There are some decent middle grounds. So for example, I could use the military governor or the secret police to significantly reduce the resistance target. So if we're doing this, let's switch it to secret police, and let's look at the resistance targets. And you see our resistance target has been reduced to 6%. So this means we have a lot lower requirements, and our resistance is basically going to almost disappear through this setting, which means we're freed up in terms of equipment that we can send to the front lines, and we're not suffering the losses here either, and it frees up some manpower as well. And we extract some more resources. The downside of this, obviously, is that we are significantly reducing the amount of compliance growth that we're getting. So it's going to take a lot longer to get to these beneficial settings. If you're in a long war and you're planning to use the occupied territory, you're not starved for resources, and you just want to minimize the amount of fuss that you have with the occupied territory, then set it as low as you can to maximize your compliance gain, and just balance it out with the resistance targets to ensure that you're not draining your resource and manpower pool. Optimize your divisions, and make sure you're not wasting any equipment. So if you were, oftentimes the game starts out with an infantry division, and if you're not paying attention to this, and you never touch this setting, and you start occupying territory, and you see that your infantry division actually has artillery and AA, and suddenly you will start seeing losses in the occupied territories here in the garrison log, and you start seeing equipment losses here, artillery, AA, and similar things, because the division gets deployed as it is designed, and that stuff's expensive and really needed elsewhere and doesn't give you any benefit. So always make sure that first thing when you start a new game is to check your default template, your default division. Get a specified division. You can always take one if you still want to use it and just duplicate it, and find yourself something. Ideally, most countries are starting off with some form of cavalry division. Ideally, something that has only cavalry and no support equipment, no support companies, and except for the MPs if you eventually want it. And as soon as you start occupying territory, that becomes quite necessary. That you can always use infantry if you don't have the cavalry ready. I would just pick whatever you have at the start of the game and switch to that. Now, the last thing I would like to mention when it comes to resistance is operatives, because you can deploy your operatives to root out resistance. Effectively, you're sending special agents in the area to find leaders and agitators among the civilian population, and assassinate them, arrest them, or turn them, bribe them, anything that you can do to stop the coordination among the rebels and to deal with these things. So if you look at your operative, you have a root out resistance mission. So you can find yourself the most resisting area And you can say, okay, I don't want the resistance to spill over from here. So if I'm looking at my resistance now, it's growing. So my agent rooting out resistance will result in a resistance target of 10% of minus 10%, which is quite large. That is a lot if you compare it to some of the laws here. That's effectively almost as much as switching from civilian to local police force, but it's only going to be effective in the territory that they're operating in. You can, if you go over to the to this, you can increase that by up to 50%. So if you get the anti-partisan upgrades, then this will increase the mission efficiency or the mission effects from the agents, and effectively will give you one step, if we're fully upgraded, one step. And you can get multiple agents operating on this in multiple areas, and you can use that sort of in combination with the resistance map to plant your agents, if they're not otherwise occupied, to plant your agents in areas of high resistance, to just lower the resistance target in these areas, and to generally counter the spreading effect that resistance has. So this is a good option that you can use. It's not going to be enough to completely avoid having to change the laws, the occupation laws, but it can, in localized places, slow down certain negative effects. And yeah, there you have it. That is how resistance works. One of those things that gets easily overlooked. So if you see that little burning fist up there, then it's definitely worth to have a quick look at your resistance map, and also to have a quick look at your occupied territories. Make sure all your settings are correct, and have a look at your garrison log, see how much equipment and manpower you've been losing. And you can also check up here to see how many troops you actually have in garrisons. You can, if you have puppets, go through the diplomacy menu and request garrison support. Obviously, Argentina is not my puppet here, so I can't do that. But so you can either be in the same faction, or if they are your puppet, then you can ask them to use their manpower to support garrisons, and that is a really, really good use for puppets. So, for example, if you're playing as Japan, which right here is no longer there, but you end up with a couple of puppet states in the beginning. So if you start the war against China, one of the things you can do, because you're going to have a lot of population to control, is literally just ask your puppeted Chinese territories to supply the troops that are going to be garrisoning. You're still going to have to supply the weapons, but the manpower can be drawn from your puppets, and that's often a good way to conserve your own manpower. Anyway, that's it for me today. Thanks everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.